morning. Welcome to the Cobb County Board of Education work session for November of 2017. As always, let's start with the Pledge of Allegiance.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you. Mr. Doyle, do we have any public comments? No public comments? Okay. So next we have the approval of the minutes from the October 26th board meeting and November 7th called meeting. And if there are no objections to approve, okay, the minutes stand approved. Now we're ready for board business. Let's begin with Mr. Scamahorn discussing board policy BBC.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. That was quick. I'm hardly awake yet. I'll pass these around if there's one for each person. If everybody has one, even though it's a somewhat lengthy policy, and it covers, I guess, other committees if the board so wished to have other committees. But the main thing that I would direct the board to is paragraph 7, and where we're suggesting that we, and that's on the third page, paragraph 7. And the title of the paragraph is simply meetings. And then subparagraph A, the committee will meet quarterly as follows: February, May, August, and October. I'm flexible with that. February was because we get our annual report in January from the previous F&T committee. So,
Excuse me, forgive me, Mr. Scamahorn. We're just talking about the F&T committee here, correct?
Yes.
Okay, I just want to make sure.
I'm sorry. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yes, the Facilities and Technologies Committee. So I'll be glad to entertain questions. The primary thing is what this does is it aligns us with the Cobb County Board of Commissioners Facilities and Technology Committee. They handle many, many more projects than do ours. It also allows for our committee members to more time as far as how their valuable time is. It's not wasted on a monthly meeting when there's not substantial agenda items. It also, I believe, helps our staff because it frees them up, and it just gives them more time to look at things. So,
all right, thank you, Mr. Scamahorn. Does anyone have any questions or comments? All right, so what is the action you're suggesting we take here?
I would like to request that the chair move this, and Mr. Parliamentarian, you may need my help because I'm not done this in quite a while, but I believe if the chair will ask if there's no objections, if we could move it to an agenda item to be voted on in December, in our December meeting, as with all the policy, I think.
Okay. Mr. Wheeler?
I have a question, Mr. Chairman. This is for the Facilities and Technology Committee only, correct?
That is my understanding. Is that correct, Mr. Scamahorn? Yes.
Yes, sir. At this time, it's my belief that that's the only committee that the board has constituted to act on our behalf.
Okay. Mr. Banks, did you have a comment?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I question why we need to break something that's not broke. This committee was instituted back when we first started Splash, and I was on the Blue Ribbon Committee back in the late 90s for 3 years, when we did have some real serious facility problems and technology problems. In fact, there were two committees then. There was a technology committee by itself, and then there was a Blue Ribbon Committee. Later on, they were combined. But we go to the voters every year, and every 5 years, and we ask them to approve a 1% sales tax for facilities and technology and textbooks. Now, we guarantee them that we will have an oversight committee, and right now, for over almost 20 years, that committee has met on a monthly basis after the board has had time to have a work session and the items presented to it in more detail. Then the following Monday, the Facilities and Technology Citizens Oversight Committee meets on a Monday and reviews what has been proposed by the superintendent to the board. At that time, they have the option of recommending approval or recommending disapproval. If we go to a quarterly basis, that could happen, create a situation where we don't have oversight for 3 months and possibly 6 months to a year, because if you don't have a quorum at one of these meetings, there's no action that can be taken. So whatever the board does, the oversight committee is irrelevant. So I question whether or not this board really wants to change something that's not broke. It's worked well, and we're very transparent to the citizens and the voters of Cobb County, and to approve something like this just says that I want to say, voters, we don't care what you think, but we do care what you think. So I strongly object to this change. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Scammahorn.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I would disagree with a fellow board member that we're not suggesting that anything's broke, but he makes the point that we've been doing the same thing for 20 years. So like anything else, you can take an item or an issue and improve it, not break it. And the idea that they would be waiting 6 months to review an item is actually ridiculous, because there's only a couple of months between the first meeting and the next meeting, or the one meeting and the next meeting. The other thing too is the primary purpose of the F&T committee, which was, I believe, my opinion, humble opinion, was misstated, was to recommend approval or disapproval. That's not the primary function of the committee. The primary function of the committee is to review the projects and to make sure they're in alignment with the SPLOS and with the rules and regulations that we're governed from. So we're not breaking anything. We're actually improving it, and we're actually giving committee members more flexibility, more time to get out in their areas and to review the projects. I yield back. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Scammahorn. You brought up the purpose, and I was just looking at and this is reading from the policy, BBC. The purpose of the committee is to strengthen accountability and transparency through a committee comprised of citizens residing within the boundaries of the district who perform reviews of all facility and technology expenditures. So if the way I read that, the idea is for them to review the expenditures to say this is how we're going to spend the SPLOS dollars. Now, I guess the question then is, does it matter whether we meet monthly or quarterly? And I'm just going to volunteer that we're getting ready here to have our quarterly financial review from the finance department here, which we review the budget quarterly as the board. So I guess the question I guess we're thinking about is, given the purpose of the committee, does it matter whether they meet monthly or quarterly? is the thing that we would be discussing. Mr. Banks.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I'd say that it does make a difference. I'll remind you, a couple of years ago, an item was brought to the board for approval, and later on, it was presented to the F&T committee. At the night meeting, or the voting meeting, when we voted on the item, an amendment was made to increase it by a substantial amount of money. Knowing this was going to happen, it was not made known to the F&T committee. When the F&T committee did review it, they resoundingly rejected the amendment, which this majority of this board did approve. But when the F&T committee had a chance to review it, the board says, no, we don't approve it. So by going to a quarterly meeting, you've got, like I said, 2 or 3 months, and possibly more, depending on where you have a quorum or not. And not all meetings have a quorum. It's too late to take action because the board has already voted, and maybe 3 months ago they voted, and the administrative staff has already started the motions of, say, architects or contracts or whatever. So it's just too late coming out of the gate. So I think from a transparency standpoint, this board needs to stay with the policy that has been in effect for at least almost 20 years. And I also would say that in conjunction with that is the board has, for over 40 years, had 2 meetings a month scheduled forever. And I know there's some talk about going to 1 meeting a month, which if that's the case, then we get into a situation where the F&T committee almost becomes irrelevant. So I strongly disapprove of changing this policy. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Well, one last comment, Mr. Chair, and thank you. It is not in the charter for the F&T committee to have approval or disapproval. It is in their charter to review and make sure the board is spending the money appropriately and in guidelines with the SPLOS. So the fact that we keep saying that they should approve or shouldn't approve, in essence, that makes them a school board, a subordinate school board for us to answer to, and we are the ones that answer to the public. And I'll leave it at that, and for others to comment. Thank you.
Okay, does anybody else have any? All right, Mr. Banks, another comment?
The F&T committee has never had the authority to approve or disapprove. What the F&T committee does is does a review, and they can recommend to the board that they approve it. But they have no authority one way or the other. But they do have an oversight committee, and these members are made up of the communities that they reside in, so they have a good feel for what the community desires as far as what they voted for. So I think to try to circumvent the will of the people, we're on some dangerous ground, and I cannot support that. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Scammahorn.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I intended not to have another comment, but I can't let go. Nobody's circumventing the will of the people. Nobody's changing the members of the F&T committee. And I do appreciate the board member acknowledging that they do not have approval, disapproval. And I would suggest that if he would go back and look at the transcript where he initially said they did have approval or disapproval. And I'll leave it at that. The language is simply out in outer space, but I'll leave it to the wisdom of the board. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Okay, thank you, gentlemen. Mr. Sweeney.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I think in general, this policy probably has some other opportunities as far as revisions are concerned. Like specifically, I mean, I think, completely agree. First of all, this is a board committee. The board cannot extend powers to any committee greater than the board already has. Okay, so from a micromanagement standpoint, we don't tell the district when to, do certain projects. Okay, we don't establish the budget. The administration establishes the budget, and the board determines whether or not we're going to approve it. The purpose of this committee was really such that if a project is in the SPLOST referendum and it's been approved by the voters, is the district spending the money on that project? It's a very, very simple charge. Now, the district, for example, has come up with some unique situations, and I'll take Teasley Elementary School as an example. Teasley Elementary School initially was a 10-classroom addition that was in the SPLOST notebook. And this is where the board actually kind of shoots itself in the foot a little bit. We've seen it with technology issues. I think at one point in time, I mean, the SPLOST may have been so specific as to actually identify even the type of operating system that we may have gone to. Is that right? Do you remember that? Okay. And by the time the expenditure came around for the operating system, we actually had to switch gears because that was now a legacy project operating system, and we had to do a different operating system. With Teasley Elementary School, it was startlingly obvious that a 10-classroom addition would not be sufficient. Yet the SPLOST notebook called for a 10-classroom addition. The board unanimously approved a modification to that, and for good reason. And today, even with a 20-classroom addition, there are now portable classrooms, I believe. Is that right? I think there's portable classrooms on that campus because of the robust student enrollment growth. So I think in some instances with regard to, our SPLOST notebook, we pigeonhole ourselves into situations where it might even create a little bit of a question as to whether or not a project should move forward. And yet, through the guidance of the administration, recommendations that are adopted by the board, we've proven that we've needed to make these modifications. The other thing I would point out, and again, just very, very simply, my understanding the entire time for this committee was that, number one, they basically are looking at, are we spending the money as the district intended that money to be spent? It's a very, very simple charge. There is no role for the F&T committee to determine what the project scope should be. Okay, that's the board's purview in supporting a recommendation that's made by the administration. There is no role for the F&T committee to determine prioritization as when a project will be done. Again, this is a recommendation that's coming from the administration, supported or not supported by the board. So the other thing I would point out is that, again, I think there's opportunities in general in this. For example, if you turn to C1, Facilities and Technology Citizens Oversight Committee, and then skip on down to just number 1, this says the purpose of the committee is to strengthen accountability and transparency through a committee comprised of citizens residing within the boundaries of the district who perform reviews of all facility and technology expenditures. There are plenty of facility and technology expenditures that take care outside the boundaries of SPLOST. Okay, so just the insertion of all facility and technology SPLOST expenditures would be an important modification in this policy. So a recommendation would be to add that, and candidly, I haven't gone through this real closely, so I personally need to take a little bit more time to review this. I can offer some recommendations relative to modifications and that kind of stuff. As far as the timing, and I pulled up the old meeting policy here. It says that the committee will meet a minimum of 6 times annually. There's no requirement that it meets on a monthly basis today. It says the committee will meet a minimum of 6 times annually, and as agreed upon by the majority of the committee, it also has a provision in here for called meetings. Okay, so in the instance of what Mr. Banks was just describing, there may be a particular anomaly that surfaces that facilities and technology may need to weigh in. This modification doesn't include that provision. all right? And so, that's something. So, again, I'd like to maybe offer some modifications to this policy, and then, we're going to have another meeting in December. This isn't an urgent thing. I mean, the Facility and Technology Committee kicks off a new year. When is their first meeting? Typically in February? February. So we've got December and February to maybe consider some modifications December and January to consider some modifications, if that's all right with you.
I have no objections. My only thought is that because it's not urgent, that we might be able to get the committee started, at the beginning of the year under the new modifications if the board so deemed it appropriate. But I'm okay with that, and or we could consider, and I'm okay with what you're saying, Scott, but we could also go ahead and put it on the agenda and then just finalize it after you have a chance to go through and make any changes.
All right.
So,
if that's okay with the chair.
I can have to Daryl. I know he's been involved in the process. If Mr. Sweeney, you and Mr. Scanlon want to discuss the tweaks and those kind of things, and then Daryl can get the changed or updated proposal out to the board.
I think there's some language in here that can be simplified, so if we could, I'll take a stab at it.
and if I may, I don't disagree with that, and I've never professed to be a language arts type person. That's why I married one of the many reasons, not the only reason. But do I understand it's okay for us to proceed, Scott, and then you and I and Mr. York will get it all together by December?
Yeah, I'm happy to work with you and also work with Mr. York on this. And then secondly, what I'd like to do is ensure that the board has a draft of this in advance of the meeting for review. So because this is the first time I think everybody's seeing this. So if we could do that, I think that would be great.
Absolutely, no problem.
So our target is December or January to bring this back? All right, we'll put this on the agenda for December. Okay, Mr. Wheeler.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I think the point is to make improvements here. It's a good idea to review and give that committee flexibility. I would agree with Mr. Sweeney to review kind of the whole thing and simplify it. It makes it better. Take a look at it, makes it better, make it work better.
All right, thank you, Mr. Wheeler. So now we're ready for your report, Mr. Ragsdale.
Yes, sir, Mr. Chair. I'm going to ask Mr. Brad Johnson to come forward and bring the quarterly financial report.
Good morning, Board. Mr. Chair, Mr. Vice Chair, members of the Board, and Mr. Superintendent. I am presenting to you today the quarterly financial report for the first quarter of fiscal year 2018. This report reflects financial data for the 3-month period ended September 30th, 2017. I will briefly cover some highlights from the first 4 sections of the report, which are finance, cash management, school food services, and capital projects. The remaining data at the end of the report is presented for informational purposes only and identifies payments and budget adjustments greater than $100,000. As always, this report will be posted to our website to enable the public to review it. For today, I've placed a copy of the presentation at your desk, and you can follow along with this hard copy or on the screen in the boardroom today. You also have the complete first quarter financial report that has a black cover at your desk that you can refer to also during the presentation or later at your leisure. So first tab, please. The first section of the report is entitled Financial Report. This section contains a summary of the financial information for each of the district's individual funds. As always, we focus on the general fund, the district's primary and largest fund. So if you look at the pie chart on the Financial Report tab, you will notice that 25% of the fiscal year has elapsed, and we have collected 24% of budgeted revenues. And we have expended or encumbered 24% of the expense budget. A broad review of general fund financial performance indicates that our revenue collections are similar to previous years, and our expenditures for the current year continue to be tight as in previous years. For revenue specifically, we have collected 24.3, it rounded to 24, of the revenues in our first quarter of the current year compared to 23% for the first quarter of the previous year, so we're slightly ahead. A specific review of expenditures shows that we specifically spent 24.4%, and it rounded to 24, of the budget in the first quarter compared to 24.98% last year. This means that our budget is slightly less tight than the previous year, but from a percentage standpoint, our estimates are right on target with limited room for estimating error. I'm pleased to say it is a little less tight because 24.98 is really right on. Our numbers are estimated in a tight range, and I think we need to continue monitoring budget to actual, and we do, very carefully as we proceed through the remainder of this fiscal year. Next slide, please. The next slide is the presentation of a summary of revenues and expenditures as of September 30th, 2017 by category. And again, this is the general fund. The format of this report are there are two sections down the left side entitled Revenue and Expenditures. Across the top, there are multiple columns for original budget, revised budget, year-to-date actual expenditures, encumbrances, and then several metrics on the right-hand side for over and under budget and percent differences. In the first column, we begin showing the original board-approved budget, which is $1.023 billion in revenue and $1.026 billion in expenditure appropriations, resulting in a board-approved budgeted use of $3.2 million in fund balance. Next, please look at the first category titled Revenue. We begin with the original and revised budget of $1.023 billion. Actual revenue collected in the first quarter was $249.5 million, which results in 24.3% of our revenue collected 1/4 of the way through the fiscal year. As many of you know, we collect most of our local property tax revenue in the second quarter of the fiscal year. So when you see a summary of revenue in our next quarterly financial report, you will see a much larger total of the revenue recorded. Next, please look at the second category titled Expenditures. For expenditures, we begin with an original budget of $1.026 billion in the first column. In the second column, we show revisions to the expenditure budget, which includes $5.9 million in encumbrances. Encumbrances are simply purchase orders issued but not yet paid. This change for encumbrances from the previous year revised expenditure budget to $1.032 billion. Actual expenditures are $246.7 million, and current year encumbrances are $4.7 million, resulting in the district having spent 24.4% of the budget, 1/4 of the way through the fiscal year. Next slide, please. The next slide in the presentation is cash management. Cash management is our second section of the report. The first section in this schedule shows that we've earned $486,000 in interest in all funds for the 3 months ended September 30th, 2017, compared to $203,000 last year at the same time. So that does reflect a slightly incremental rising interest rates. And you all will remember what I've told you all, that we were earning 0.2% interest. Now it's gone over the 1% threshold, which is a good thing. So it's incrementally, slowly rising. Interest rates are slowly rising, but they're going to continue to be slow for some time now. It appears that they will only rise at an incremental pace. Our accounting department continues to be diligent to invest idle funds at the highest possible rates. Georgia law mitigates how risky we can be. In fact, we have to be very safe with taxpayer funds according to Georgia law. But despite these slow rates, We regularly consult with our financial advisor, Courtney Knight of the PFM Group, in order to maintain or obtain the best possible market rate of return, while at the same time ensuring that investments are safe. Next slide, please. The next section of the presentation I present is the school food service report. This report shows meal-related activities at each school for both the current month and the fiscal year to date. For 2017 overall in the first quarter, elementary schools show a year-to-date loss of $796,000. Middle schools have a loss of $144,000. High schools have a loss of $30,000. And finally, the other section, which is USDA commodities and equipment purchases, have a profit of $130,000. All of these combined show a total program loss of a negative $841,000, 1/4 of the way through the current fiscal year. Please note, as always, and you have seen these numbers before, that it's not unusual for food service programs to start off the year with a loss due to the fact that the fund has to pay for July and August salaries before the new year cafeteria sales begin coming in. Additionally, this program lost 2 days of revenue as a result of the Irma hurricane event. We hope that this program will continue to operate as a break-even status. The fund balance in this fund is very sufficient, and we hope it is a break-even status even in the continuing face of the Healthy Kids Act of 2010, which we've described to you previously. Next slide, please. The next section of the quarterly financial report that I would like to present is the SPLOST and capital project section. These sections reflect revenue and expenditures in the capital project funds. This includes SPLOST 3, SPLOST 4, and the countywide building fund. One thing I'd like to point out in this section is illustrated in the SPLOST 4 tab and also on the screen or at your desk in the handout. This schedule shows that collections for SPLOST 4 in calendar year 2017, while coming in below forecast projections, are ahead in terms of this year's actual compared to last year's actual. SPLOST 4 actual calendar year sales tax collections for the 9 months beginning at September 30th are $101 million, which is 9.6% below projections. But at the same time, it is 4.4% ahead of last year's actual compared to actual. This increase does reflect an improving economy. Inception to date, SPLOST 4 actual sales tax collections are $471 million compared to projections of $510 million, or 7.8% below projections. Some comments regarding these revenue collections. As I look at the monthly revenue collections, they seem to be incrementally slightly increasing, which is a good sign. We think this is due to a lot of factors besides an improving economy. We continue to monitor these revenues. We do think that major projects such as the new Braves Stadium and the additional sales tax for those and other big projects could impact it. And it is anticipated that the district could collect dollars for state construction funding that could possibly assist the district in capital building programs. Mr. Chair, this concludes my presentation for the first quarter financial report.
Thank you, Mr. Johnson. Always a great report, and I bet we have some questions, comments. We'll start with Mr. Wheeler.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Johnson, I may have asked this question before, but you refresh me. Who's the one that's doing these projections? Is this our department or is this some other outside agency?
Are you referring to the SPLOST?
Yes.
And I think we had KSU doing those projections.
Yeah, we have used both KSU and Georgia State. Matter of fact, both were used. You know, I know where you're getting at.
They never seem to be anywhere as close to what
it's
the actual numbers are.
Yeah, it's kind of like a weatherman. But
Just curious if we actually need a projection.
All right, Ms. Thayer.
But don't we always project a little high on that? Because if we, unlike the county, we can't, when we reach a certain dollar, when we reach the amount that we said we were going to collect, we have to stop. So to not jeopardize our schools and our needs, particularly now with all the growth that we're experiencing, we always project high there. So we never expect to really meet that. Is that correct?
Yes, you are absolutely correct. But the projections that we get from whether it be KSU or Georgia State or Georgia State, they don't take that into consideration, but we know that. So when we deal with their projections, we obviously take into account exactly what Ms. Thayer said, because again, this is truly a dice roll at best, because trying to predict exactly how much revenue is going to come in when nothing has happened economically, ups or downs, is difficult at best. But then you throw into the mix a recovering economy, then you have the Braves Stadium. You really don't know how much that's going to bring in. So I will go back and reflect on the SPLOS 5 notebook for a second. One of the big benefits that we have in SPLOS 5 is the category of undesignated classrooms. This allows the situation Ms. Thayer explained for potentially projects not to be impacted by the ups and or downs in the economy. When you don't have an undesignated classroom account, then you truly run the risk of, when you have, whether it be budget shortfalls, budget overages, as far as what the cost of a project is going to be, but also, most importantly, the inconsistent nature that we see in SPLOST revenue. When you look at, comparatively speaking, the actuals is really the true comparison from last year to this year. But then, you got to remember SPLOST 4. SPLOST 4 was initiated and revenues were being collected just as the car tag tax, the birthday tax, was changed. So again, that was an impact that was absolutely unknown. There was no way to determine that. We actually now are running through some situations that we've just become aware of, that potentially some of that, as far as the way cars are purchased, may be changing next January, that we're running the numbers on. We'll bring you a report as soon as we have information on that. But, it just stands to reason that it just shows how difficult it is to identify the revenue for a SPLOS program, because when you put it together, it's obviously years out before you even start collecting revenue. But then when revenue comes in, there's no way that when we put together a notebook for a SPLOS that we're able to forecast, predict, get a crystal ball. There's no way to determine what kind of factors are going to influence that. So you both are right. The projections are off. But we do have to project high. Not that we did the projections, but we have to take into account when we get the analysis and the forecast from KSU or Georgia State, we have to put in a variable that says, okay, we know if we say $700 million, as soon as $700 million is collected, we have to stop. Right. That's why we've been so cognizant in the past of making sure that we didn't have a break in revenue collections, because that also injects a serious level of chaos and confusion, as far as, you have to think about every single person, company, store, et cetera, that charges tax for purchases has to reprogram their system for that sales tax to be taken. So it's, I do, kind of along this same line, I do want the projections to be more accurate. At the same time, I want to be able to have access to data that we can have confidence in. For example, knowing how much a particular vendor or company is contributing to a SPLOS, for example, in Cobb County, like Home Depot, for example. That would also benefit us in being able to have a more accurate projection, but at the same time, regardless of how accurate the projections are or are not, we're going to have to make sure that we put into that, as Ms. Thayer mentioned, to that unknown factor, so that we don't hit the number. Because I hope that we never hit the number. But again, looking at SPLOS 4, we didn't have, and SPLOS 3, we didn't have an undesignated classroom category, so that made it all the more difficult in the forecasting, but also in the prioritization of projects as well.
Okay, Mr. Banks.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And the superintendent is correct. And when SPLOS 4 was initiated, the car tax was not on the table. It was not even being considered. And my understanding is there's approximately $60 million that we will not receive through SPLOS, but we will get that money through the general fund. So there's a good and a bad part. If it had not occurred, then we would actually have had to stop probably in October or November of next year, because we would already collected the total amount that was originally projected for SPLOS 4. So in some ways it's good, in some ways it's bad, but we're not that far off from prior years as far as the actual percentages, and our percentages are greatly improving every month. So I suspect by the end of 2018, we will probably be very close to 100%. I don't think I'll be 100%, but I think we'll be very close to it. Also, I lost my train of thought, so give me a second here. We were talking about, okay, in SPLOS 3 and some of 4, but mainly 2 and 3, we were able to generate a substantial amount of revenue from interest. In fact, Mr. Morgan was here. I think some other board members were here too. We were able to give back to the taxpayers $67 million from the SPLOS funds. So that brought down we were able to generate money into the general fund, and also buy down the millage rate back down to 18.9. So the taxpayers did not see an increase, but the school system did benefit from the extra revenue. That was a one-time shot. Well, we did it over 3 years, so I don't see that happening because the interest rates just aren't there anymore. So we're not going to make the fabulous money that we used to make. But in 5, I know what I was going to say. I think the MDJ, I had an article a few weeks ago about Cobb County. Their projections, although they do a 6-year SPLOS, their projection was under $800,000. Now they're projecting that it's actually going to wind up probably being over $850 million. So if their projections are accurate, I think we'll hit the 797 mark and possibly go over it in the next 6 years, because we got 6 years before SPLOS 5 actually ends. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Banks. Mr. Scammahorn.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just a couple of quick questions. One on the food nutrition program. We're basically $1 million in the hole, and you mentioned that we generally come out of that or close. Do you see an issue of recovering this year, that $1 million?
We hope that it'll end up being status quo. We hope we'll make it up.
I like that, we hope.
Well, we do. I mean, it just depends on food service sales. It depends on student participation in the meals. It depends on a lot of factors.
And I know you're finance, not food service, but I would ask Mr. Ragsdale, has the federal government kind of lessened their restrictions on what we serve, and are things getting better?
Well, we hope to see the day that kids will be able to have as many packs of ketchup with their chicken nuggets as they wish. However, that day is not here yet. So we do hope that things are going to change because, quite honestly, the change that occurred was quite abysmal as far as the food not food service division, but as far as the food in the schools for our kids was concerned, it created a very negative situation. I think it had an absolute blowback effect in that what we saw was, especially high school kids that had transportation options immediately after school, they went to the fast food places. So while you can make the argument that the food in the cafeteria programs now is more healthy than it was, if they're not consuming it and they're going to fast food establishments. And there's certainly healthy options you can get from fast food establishments. However, I doubt that that was going to be the primary choice. So to answer your question, we have not seen that yet. We do hope to see that because there is rumbling about that being modified at the federal level, and sooner the better as far as I'm concerned.
Thank you. And my other question, Mr. Johnson, well, before I ask the question, as usual, excellent job, and you and your staff are extremely professional and very succinct with keeping us informed. But looking forward 6 months to a year, do you see any specific pitfalls or things that we need to be maybe not alarmed but concerned with?
I don't think there's anything that you all as a board are not already aware of. You all know the budget challenges and the revenue challenges. I don't think there's anything new to report.
Okay. Do you do see our revenue increasing, even if it's methodically or slowly?
Very slow and incremental.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you.
Let me hit that, though, because I'd be remiss if I didn't say, while to use your term, methodically, the revenue is increasing, but at a much less rate than additional expenditures are being required. Not expenditures that we're doing as a district, but requirements from the general fund budget, whether it be classified health insurance or those kind of things. The unfunded mandates, the revenue is not increasing at a greater rate than those particular additional stresses are being added to the general fund.
Okay. Well, with that note, one more quick thing. Is there any changes do you see coming from the state legislature which might help not only us but all school districts? Because if I remember correctly, I think there are school districts that are taking out loans to offset their deficit, or did. Now, am I in error with that?
So I can't speak specifically to what districts are doing. I can tell you that we don't necessarily see anything coming as far as a budget issue. And that's kind of the bad news because we know what our situation is. So not having anything on the horizon that we can point to that's going to be different is kind of bad news because we're not going to have another good budget. Now, that being said, when we get to our legislative priorities, we certainly have one legislative priority that could have some positive impact for us in the budgetary arena. So we hope that, our delegation especially, but also the General Assembly would take note of that and hopefully get some traction on that.
Thank you, Mr. Superintendent. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Scamhorn, Mr. Banks, and then Mr. Sweeney.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have a request for the superintendent. Today is the first time we've seen the financials for the quarter. Would it be, are you able to give us this data, say 10 days before the meeting so that we can actually review it and if we have questions? Because the way it's set up right now, if we don't have the questions right now, we don't get another opportunity to question it. So if it's possible, I would like to see this presented to the board or made available to the board at least 10 days before the meeting.
We'll certainly look at that and being able to provide the board with the report ahead of time. But on the flip side of that, this is not a one-time event during the board meeting. I mean, you individually, board members are encouraged to, communicate with cabinet and above. But anytime, you need to you have questions or concerns, that kind of thing, I encourage you to get with Brad.
Well, I was not thinking so much of a question, but the public needs to know when we see some things that the public should know that we're doing very well. We have an opportunity to express that to the public because we're televised, and a lot of people do watch this board meeting. So I'm thinking about how we relate and communicate with our constituents out there.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Banks. Mr. Sweeney.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. One thing I just want to comment on is, the remarkable cooperation that actually occurs between the assessor's office here within the county and the Cobb County School District, and also the manner and I would say the method in which the assessor's office has actually kind of kept pace with property values. I think Mr. Scamahorn, when he referenced, borrowing, for example, the horrible situation that occurred within Fulton County just recently. The tax digest, as I understand there, was rejected by the state and therefore prohibited the tax assessments or the property tax bills from going out into the community, thereby forcing the Atlanta public school system and I believe the Fulton County system to do some short-term borrowing because there was no way that they were going to recognize the property tax revenues this year. And I know that's still a contentious issue, and there's certain things that still need to be adjudicated, but the importance of the cooperation in this county cannot be overemphasized, and particularly the responsible nature in which those actions do take place, and it has allowed us to at least get the revenues into the school district on a timely basis. Situation such as occurred could be catastrophic to a school system. Thank you.
Yeah, I want to echo that because, it's not every county that has the great working relationship that we have between the Board of Commissioners and Board of Education, whether it be board member to commissioner, board member kind of thing, or whether it be from staff to staff. We have a great relationship with the county, and I appreciate you pointing that out, Mr. Sweeney, because Brad is in communication and his staff with the county regularly, and that cooperation on knowing how properties are being reevaluated and those kind of things benefits us and also puts us in a position not to unfortunately have the situation that Fulton is in. Now, I will, going back to Mr. Scamahorn's question about schools borrowing, when I was in Paulden, it was an SOP that we got a loan every year to make payroll from August, September, because the taxes didn't come in until, later into the calendar year. Now, we're not in that situation, but many districts, I'm sure, still are, just because they don't have the cash flow. Now, and that's why we put so much emphasis on the fund balance, because that situation allows our fund balance health allows us to not be in that situation, and that's what Brad and his staff do an excellent job of, is to making sure that we know what the cash flow is, and we can avoid that. And that's not saying that it's the end of the world to have to get a short-term loan because of cash flow, but if you can avoid it, that's certainly advantageous, and we are certainly in a much better position, even with the budget struggles and hurdles that we have. We're in a much better position than most financially, and I appreciate not only Brad and his staff's work that they do, but the cooperation between the county, as you mentioned, helps allow that to happen as well.
Thank you, Mr. Superintendent. Mr. Sweeney had a follow-up, and then Mr. Scamahorn has a comment.
Yeah, and I just wanted to comment on something the superintendent said earlier. And the thing is that the revenues and the growth, I think, going forward is not going to be as robust. We've been very, very blessed, recently. But as I think when we talked about this during our last meeting, our total tax digest is still below where we were in the 2008-2009 period. Yet our expenses, as you cited, have escalated during that time, and we're also continuing to serve a greater student population as our enrollment grows. So again, and the challenges going forward on the budget are going to be pretty tough. And despite all of this, I think it's really, really important to know, for the community to understand, is that the district still remains debt-free. I mean, this school district, 23rd, 24th largest school system in the entire country, is debt-free. We're one of the largest systems, if not the largest system in the entire country to be debt-free. And it's my understanding that we still enjoy a AAA credit rating, which is very, very difficult for any school district to attain simply because of the irregularities in the revenue streams that is typical for a school system. Thank you.
Let me respond too real quick, because I'd be remiss if I didn't. We've said this phrase a couple of times about talking about how expenditures have increased. And I want to be very, very cognizant of the way we describe that phrase that we're using, because expenditures increasing is not reflective of we're hiring more people or we're putting in more programs into the district. The expenditures, and the reason I say that is because there's always some of the people out there that say, oh, well, you need to live within your means. And so when we talk about expenditures increasing, I want to be very deliberate in explaining that and what it means, and more importantly, what it doesn't mean, because I'll still come back to the stat, which is empirical, that shows that we are still the lowest as far as central administration is concerned, expenditure-wise in the metro Atlanta area. And that, just like you were talking about, having the AAA credit rating and being debt-free, that is very, very important for our community to understand that even with the budget hurdles that we have, we are still lean. I won't say mean, but, because we're kind of nice sometimes. Depends on what the day it is. But in all seriousness, I mean, I want I want the public to know, to your point, Mr. Banks, the public does need to know that we are very, very conscientious stewards of taxpayer dollars and what those are expended toward. And again, as our mission indicates, our primary reason to exist is for student success. So when we talk about expenditures increasing, that's not to say that we're just putting a bunch of wish list items into the budget, because we certainly are not. There are many items that we wish we could put into the budget, but we just quite honestly can't afford to. But appreciate you bringing up those points.
Mr. Scamahorn.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and the superintendent's comments, a good segue. I just want to emphasize to all that the good working relationships that the superintendent was talking about, whether it's with the county or the state and with each other and the staff, just doesn't happen. It takes effort and work and making sure it's a two-way street, a give and take thing. So it's commendable to not only our finance department, but the entire staff that we're able to rise above minor differences and both with the county and within ourselves to make sure we're clicking on all cylinders. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Scamahorn. Anyone else? While we've been having this discussion, I reflected back on an appraisal course, real estate appraisal course I took when I was at Georgia, who is still ranked number 7, by the way, even though it's not 1.
They went out yesterday.
So anyway, but the idea was you take all the data, all the facts, and Dr. Schenkel, I think it was Dr. Schenkel, he used to say, and then you must take the inductive leap. And that's what Brad and his team do, and what a lot of us do is we gather it all, and then we still have to be leapers and do the best we can. So I think we do a fantastic job. The other thing that occurred to me is when we talk about SPLOST and we talk about revenue, when we do our intro, we see our post as they come together to form a map of Cobb County. And so I got to thinking, and this occurred to me Monday night and occurred to me again today, as Cobb County has grown, we've pushed out to the edges. Lori and I went to a function over in Sandy Springs Monday night, and where we live off Wade Green Road, we went 92. So I always forget, you see that Cobb County sign on one side, but as we have grown, we might have a new $600,000 home out on the edge, and they're paying property taxes, but they're shopping in Fulton County or they're shopping in Cherokee County. Likewise in South Cobb. When you get to a certain point, it's easier to go to Douglas County and spend your retail money. So, I would love to see a chart, if anybody ever has the time, of how property taxes and sales tax revenue relate to each other, because I guess what I'm summarizing is new residences in Cobb County does not indicate the same amount of growth for SPLOST as it used to, because we're pushing out. I just thought I'd throw that out so that people kind of have a picture, all right? Anything else on this subject?
You're a man of wisdom.
Oh, I don't know about wisdom. Crazy. I'm catching up with you. All right, Mr. Rexton.
Oh, gracious. Okay, so agenda item number 1 is the monthly occurrence of the recommendation for authorization of school properties disposal per District Administrative Rule DO-R. Be happy to answer any questions, and the board has received that list electronically.
Okay, if there's no objection, consent agenda. Very good. Mr. Adams?
All right, so agenda item number 2, I'm going to ask Mr. John Adams to come and bring the various architect appointments, and I will introduce this as a reminder that while these major construction projects, as we're looking at, are listed in SPLOST 5, we already have the architect appointed for Harmony Leland Elementary School. So some of those out there might be wondering, well, why are you not doing that? You said it was going to be the first project. We already have that architect appointed. So, and that design work has been in process. So, Mr. Adams.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Superintendent, Mr. Chair, members of the board, good morning. This is a good news agenda item. In keeping with the spirit of that prior Harmony Leland appointment, our goal today is to bring to you 4 architect appointments and to prepare the work for those projects so that we can begin work in the first year of SPLOST 5 in 2019. You may see some more coming also. Our goal is to be aggressive in our pursuit of those items in 5. So agenda item number 2, recommendation for approval of architect appointments for Campbell High School addition modification, Pebblebrook High School addition modification, King Springs Elementary School replacement, and Instructional Support Center addition and modification. Of course, as we always do in accordance with Rule FEAB, we do have a schedule that determines what we pay architects for various projects. As you're aware, we try to match architects to specific projects based on what we think the needs of those projects would be. Each project is unique and the strengths of that particular architect. We're recommending that you allow us to appoint Collins Cooper Carusi Architects out of Atlanta for Campbell High School's addition modification, Cooper Carey Architects out of Atlanta for Pebblebrook High School's addition modification, Stevens and Wilkinson out of Atlanta for the King Springs Elementary School replacement, and Croft and Associates for the Instructional Support Center addition modification. We're recommending you allow us to do that and execute those contracts. You see the costs listed below in accordance with FEAB, 5% of the construction estimate. The exact items you see listed below, but for Campbell High School, we think that this would be $1.413 million for the architect. Pebblebrook, $2.175. King Springs Elementary School, $1.368, and Instructional Support Center, $646,000. Again, the exact cost listed. I will point out that these costs will initially be paid for out of the general fund, but that the architectural costs will eventually be reimbursed to the general fund out of SPLOST 5. So I'm available for any questions.
Okay. Ms. Thayer.
Thank you, Mr. Adams, and thanks for bringing these forward. Can you go over the difference in dollars on these projects, why there would be a difference, particularly like in Campbell and Pebblebrook?
Yes, ma'am. Campbell High School is slated to receive a significant classroom addition and a theater. Pebblebrook High School is slated to receive a classroom addition, a theater, and a gym. So the delta on that would be the architectural design cost for the additional gym.
Right. And Campbell received their gym in SPLOST 4.
Yes,
So
ma'am.
that's the difference in that. And then King Springs, of course, is a complete tear down and rebuild on that. Great.
Correct.
Okay.
Correct.
And then everyone has to understand, of course, that while we're doing this in advance, no construction will ever take place before January of 2019, because these are all SPLOST 5 projects, so, okay.
Yes, ma'am. We will, of course, bring you individual construction items at a later date for their individual approval and not begin any work until SPLOST 5.
Right. And how were the different architects chosen for each project?
We maintain it's a small stable, but a stable of architects that we try to match to each specific project. We also think that keeps them on their toes, so to speak, and always having to compete for projects, trying to get the best result for our stakeholders. But in the case of Campbell, for example, Collins Cooper Carusi was chosen because they're also the architect, in part, because they're also the architect working on the gym currently.
Right.
So we'll have some not only economy of scale, but some good consistency there. In general, though, we look at what kind of projects that firm has done for the district in the past or currently doing, what their particular strength may be, and all 4 of these architects have done significant prior work successfully for the district.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
Mr. Scammahorn.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And Ms. Thayer, on her follow-up question, kind of answered what I wanted to ask, but more specifically, for the benefit of the public, we choose our architects and our construction firms. We have an extensive rubric, if you will, or system where, and it's not a closed shop. It's anybody can compete. It's just those that have been in our system a while know kind of how we operate. Is that all correct?
Yes, sir, that's correct. And our goal is always to get good value for the taxpayers, but not necessarily the low bidder, so to speak. Not that we always use a bid. We're looking for the most bang for our buck for our taxpayers and our stakeholders to get the best possible result.
There you go. Thank you, Mr. Adams, and job well done. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Scammahorn. Mr. Banks.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Adams, the school district has, since 2009, have built, I believe, 4 new elementary schools. Eastside, Smyrna, Mableton, and Mountain View. I believe each one has a different floor layout plan. And these schools are built for approximately 1,000 students. My question is, why do we reinvent the wheel when a standard floor plan could be adopted and used by each elementary school rebuild, just like we'd have done in the past with the high schools? Kell, I think Kennesaw Mountain and Altoona are basically the same school. With that, and the second question, would it save money if only one architect was appointed to as overseer of these elementary schools, so that we don't have to redo the plans? I realize that topology, site work has to be done, which we have to pay for, but from a footprint standpoint, why are we reinventing the wheel each time?
That's an excellent question. First of all, you heard me reference a small but a stable of architects that we try to match to each project. We do routinely use architects for different projects, so I don't know that we reinvent the wheel completely from scratch each time, even though it might be a different architect. Typically, they have done similar projects. But these schools are kind of like our children, metaphorically and literally. And when we ask a teacher to work with a child in the classroom, we ask that teacher to meet the child where they are and to differentiate the instruction for that child to maximize that child's learning, not to be cookie cutter with 25 kids the same way in every classroom. We do the same things with our schools. Each one, as you said, does have a different topology, different needs. So we try to match that to the architect and not have a homogeneous one-size-fits-all approach. We also, I'm proud to say, more than most districts, allow for flexibility based in part on principal input to best design a school to try to meet the needs of that school as the principal sees it. There are other very large districts that are so rigid and structured that principals can't even pick the color of the walls. Everything is beige. And I don't think we want to adopt that kind of cookie-cutter homogeneous approach. On the money side, I will point out that we pay architects a lot less than other competing districts in the metro area, so much so that architects complain a little bit about that, but we still can get them to put forth interest in these projects and give us a good result. So while in theory we might be able to save some money by having a one-size-fits-all approach, I think that would not probably be the best value for the district in the long term, and that we're already doing an excellent job of wringing as much value out of the architects and keeping costs down as any district in the metro area.
And the reason I bring this up, we've got Brumby in the works right now, and it's a different footprint. And we've got East Valley that's going to come online later on, and I think there may be another elementary school, I'm not sure, in Splice 5 that's not on the table yet. So I'm just wondering, why are we, as many elementary schools are in the process or have been in the process of being rebuilt, why are we paying, all this architectural money to do basically the same thing for each school? So, I mean, I raised the question. If there's good reasons why we do it, I'm fine with that.
Yes, sir. Valid question, and there's good and bad for everything, but we think on balance this is the best approach.
Ms. Thayer and then Mr. Scammahorn.
This is all, I mean, I hadn't really thought along these lines, but I do like the idea of having a standard, particularly where we have people in our communities that think one side of the system gets treated differently than the other side. So I think that would stop a lot of that feeling. Again, I think you have to look at topography and needs of the school. But again, I think the more standardization that we had in buildings, the better we would be. And I think some of that would make a lot of sense.
I agree completely. There's a balance, and that's exactly why about a year ago we instituted a new position with the board's approval that is a director of architectural design and standards, Paul Walker in our SPLOST office, who is himself an architect. His primary job is to make sure that there's consistency between projects so that schools are equitable, knowing that they're all going to be a little bit different. So I think we're doing much better in that area since he came on board and is tasked with that primary responsibility.
Let me jump in too, because one thing I want to speak to is we do have district specs. And so when it comes to construction, and the spec is the size of the classroom, right? So and what's in the classroom, equipment-wise and functionality-wise. So the standard is there. The one thing that I wanted to throw out, though, too, so that prevents, one school from being a totally different school building and expenditure than another one. Now, granted, like Mr. Banks said, when you get into topography, that drives a lot of it, as far as stories, perhaps, and those kind of things. And then elementary schools, of course, Teasley, we mentioned the addition there. That was challenging because we had to do multi-levels, and there are restrictions on what grade levels you can have on a second floor. That doesn't have a own level entry. But the one thing I wanted to throw out, too, about the architects, kind of speaking to Mr. Banks's point, as you can see here on the cost, the architectural cost is 5% of the actual construction cost of the project, not how much, design work is done. So if, so it wouldn't, and now correct me if I'm wrong, if I'm getting out of line here, but, because I'm violating the principle of asking a question that I don't know the answer to in a public meeting, right? So, just going on previous experience, though. Yeah, exactly. So, the architectural cost set at 5% of the construction cost. The construction cost does not include whether or not they've had to create a school from scratch or whether or not they have done a plan that's exactly like, Hillgrove is like Kell, is like, Harrison, et cetera. I know they're not, so don't anybody say, well, they're not the same. I know that. But the point is that those architectural costs right there, number one, are an estimate, but number two is based on the construction cost. So regardless of whether or not they, like I said, they start from scratch and do the design, because most architects anyway are going to have plans to pull from to say, hey, what do you think about, this look, feel, touch of a school, design, footprint, et cetera. So from a budgetary standpoint, whether or not we used a cookie cutter approach for plans or whether or not we started from scratch at every single school, that 5% is still going to be based on the actual construction cost. Now, again, if you try to build a Taj Mahal, and it's not, you're putting in things that are not consistent with the facility specs that we have, then that's going to be caught by Paul Walker, who John just described, that he is an architect and is in-house, so he has that ability to make sure we catch things. If we need to value engineer because of whatever environmental factors are coming into play, then we can do that as well. But the bottom line I wanted to make is 5% is 5% of the construction cost, regardless of how much design work.
Did you have something else? Or okay, go ahead.
And I hear all that too, but there are things that I do think standardization is something that we need to go more toward. When you go to Wheeler High School and their latest edition, and you can find this in a number of different places, but where you walk up and you see a curved wall, and a curved wall is always more expensive than a straight line, and you walk in and see that staircase and so forth, that's not happening everywhere. I think we need more standardization to make sure, and again, I think it would stop some of this feeling of differences in different places. So again, I would certainly like us to have more standardization. I think that would be good because what's good for one campus is good for another campus within that topography, understanding there will be changes. But if this construction material is good for one school, then it should be good for another and things of that nature. So I would be a big proponent of having as much standardization as we can have in our schools. Once we find a good plan, then it would, we should stick to it as much as possible for me. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Thayer. Mr. Scamahorn.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I don't know if Mr. Adams would like to comment on, but in our process, if I understand it correctly, at least it's happened in my area numerous times, is we involve the principal, the administration, community. Assume the principal pulls in the community, and there is some healthy tension that goes on, during multiple meetings to do that. And I agree that standardization might cut our costs, and I don't disagree with what Ms. Thayer's. I strongly agree with what you're saying. However, topography is a significant driver in how we design. I'm certainly glad that we didn't put a Teasley footprint at Mountain View. It's just not going to fit, and Mountain View's footprint wouldn't fit on that hillside that Teasley's on. And last example I simply point out is when they were doing, and they're currently still doing the construction at North Cobb, and they dug down in to start doing that thing, right. And they ran into the foundation of Stone Mountain. There was no end to it, and we were going to have to drive the costs significantly higher to dynamite that, as well as the environment and the surrounding communities. So I don't disagree with what's been said, but geez, there's a lot of significant things that go into what we can and can't do.
Very briefly, and I hate that Mr. Morgan's not here to hear me make a baseball reference, which is not my sport, but Tommy Lasorda, arguably the most successful baseball manager in history, he has something that's now referred to as the Lasorda rule. And he's really describing personnel, but this would apply also to facilities and the whole idea of how much standardization is too much and how much is not enough. And we could have a healthy debate about where on the spectrum we currently fall, to Ms. Thayer's point. But the Lasorda rule says you got to hold whatever it is, people or stuff, kind of like you're holding a bird. You want to keep the bird and maintain control of it, but if you hold it too tight, you crush it and kill it. So there's always a balance as to how delicately to hold that bird, and that's a good discussion to have.
All right, Ms. Thayer.
The one point I wanted to make was when I was saying, more standardization, I said, of course, we have to consider topography. That's always critical in every situation. But, I think I've been a part too, though, of even as a board member, looking at splost items where we had a principal change. One was when I went to a school, Lindley Sixth Grade Academy, I'll name it. We had a principal there who was saying, we've got to have a bus awning, we've got to have a bus awning. The next year there was a principal change, and that principal said, we don't need a bus awning, we need this. So principals change, their ideas of what's needed change is all I'm saying. Sometimes the system has a better knowledge of what's needed than a principal does. So that was my point. Thanks.
All right. But, Mr. Ragsdale.
Let me throw out what I think is probably one of the best examples that we can say as far as standardization and how that looks differently at different places. And that is the current standard for our gyms. We started at Wheeler. We're building a 3,000-seat gym. A 3,000-seat gym at Wheeler is going to look different than a 3,000-seat gym at Harrison, is going to look different than a 3,000-seat gym at Campbell, et cetera, et cetera. So, in North Cobb. The design of how that 3,000-seat gym comes to fruition is going to be different, but the standard is 3,000-seat gym. So everybody that's getting a new gym is going to get a 3,000-seat gym with that standard being in place. But depending on where it is, i.e. what school it is, and depending on where on the campus it is, it could possibly have to look different because of the design. So I think that's a great example of how that line moves. While you've got a standard of 3,000-seat gym, the configuration of that gym is going to look different depending on what campus you're on.
Thank you, Chris. Let's see, Mr. Banks.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I actually have some questions, concerns about the legal language, since we are actually using general fund money on a temporary basis and hopefully being able to pay it back in SPLOST 5. Do we need some legal language in this agenda item that reflects that, so that when this comes up, maybe in 2019, 2020, that we have a basis of paying back a loan, because actually it is just a loan, but we don't state that in here. We just say reimbursement. But I'm just wondering if we need that legal, and Mr. Doyle is not here. So
well, that's going to say, Mr. Banks.
We can hold this question until he comes back if you want to.
That, or would you want to, this is going to be a discussion item for the business. Yeah, we're not going to vote on it until December.
No,
so
well, let's just wait till he comes back, and then
okay.
you can bring it back.
All right. And Mr. Scamahorn, did you want to follow up? Mr. Doyle, we noted your absence during a legal question.
I knew that would happen.
Yeah, that you can bet on it. So, Mr. Banks, if you could briefly restate your question.
I'm questioning whether we should have some legal language in here to indicate that this is a loan from the general fund that will be paid back in from SPLOST 5 funds, so that 2 years from now, when we try to pay this back, we have a legal basis for why we're doing it. And it's not stated here. We just say reimbursement, but that we're really saying a loan, but we don't say a loan.
Well, and I wouldn't consider it a loan because it's really two different funds of the school district. One is just much more restricted than the other. And the board could put strings on, like that on there, but I don't think there's any need to. I think I think you have some accounting balances and checks in place to catch any kind of problems that may come up, I think, which might be concerning you, but I don't have any concern with doing it as they propose.
Well, one of the concerns I have is we'll have a new board in 2019, so they could have a different opinion on some of these things. I just want to make sure that when it comes time to pay this back, we have a legal obligation to pay it back.
Well, that would get into another complicated question of binding a subsequent board to do something. And so, I mean, I can see your point, but it's fine, I think, from a legal standpoint.
Thank you, Mr. Banks. Mr. Scamahorn? You yield. Okay. Anyone else have any comments or questions regarding the subject at hand? All right, without objection, because this is SPLOS, it'll go into discussion for the December business meeting. Okay, now, Mr. Superintendent.
Yes, sir, Mr. Chair, members of the board, you have at your place a copy of the 2018 legislative priorities that we discussed briefly. Well, not briefly, but have been discussed. I'm asking the board to approve these, take action on these today, such that we can get with the printer. Obviously, this is just a textual version. We want to get the cards printed up so that we have those for the delegation meeting in early December. So be happy to discuss each one at length. Obviously, we've got some holdovers from last year, but one of the ones that we made reference to during the budget presentation is the first one, which is to include local exemptions when calculating the state of Georgia local 5 mil share. This is very important in my mind, and I hope this gets some traction because it's kind of a one-way street when it should be a two-way street. Actually, state exemptions are included and allowed in the formula that calculates the local 5 mil share or local fair share. We're just wanting it to be fair. And so here we do list some numbers in this priority. As you can see, we actually contribute as a county in excess of 5 mils, approximately 6.2 mils, which negatively impacts our district by approximately $27 million. So it's not like we're asking for local exemptions to be included when state exemptions are not. State exemptions are already included, so we're just asking that local exemptions be included as well. I would deduce that this would be a benefit to many school districts throughout the state. Do we want to discuss each one or just, okay.
I saw Mr. Scamahorn's hand first, and then Mr. Banks, it's you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. My only question is, at our retreat or before, it was agreed upon, at least I thought it was, that we would have a point paper with our rationale and justification behind each one of these, and I was wondering if that's available.
Yes, we'll get that as soon as the board approves them.
Okay.
They're not officially our 2018 legislative priorities until the board takes action on those. Okay. So definitely we'll get the talking points for each one to the board.
Okay, thank you.
Absolutely.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Yes, Mr. Scamahorn. Okay, Mr. Banks, and then Mr. Sweeney.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We had a discussion in the retreat about formulating the language, the statute language, to present to the legislators. And I made the comment about the legislators being lazy. They don't write their own statutes. They have a legal counsel down there that does actually all the research, and they actually draft the language. And if anybody's ever read the statute for QBE and fully understands it, they're a very, very wise person because it's very, very complex. And so we need to, I think, have something in hand that says, okay, here's what we want the statute to look like and to read so that these deductions that we have locally can be addressed from a local standpoint to our legislators so that they don't have to, they can just carry it and one of the legislators can make the introduction to the General Assembly. So I would recommend that we go to the trouble of actually creating and drafting the language of what we want QBE to be as far as how we're going to incorporate these deductions that we have in Cobb County. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Okay, Ms. Thayer.
Let it be known that the comments of one board member do not reflect the feelings of the entire board. Thank you.
probably, I won't even try to say it. Mr. Scamhorn.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, but could I temporarily yield to Mr. Morgan, then you come back to me?
Mr. Morgan?
Appreciate that, Mr. Scamahorn. Question I have is, Chris and I was just briefly discussing this. The graduation rate was a part of the agenda last year, correct? What, if any, traction did we get? Was there any receptivity? What is the pushback? What were the contours behind that particular item?
Yeah, it really didn't get much traction at all. And that's why this year you can see that we give, for example, we wanted to give something specific in writing that the delegation and the legislators could actually take into account, because one of the biggest ones is when we have a student leave a school in a district. An inordinate amount of time is spent trying to track that student down, whether it's Facebook stalking or, whatever the case is. We shouldn't have employees spending time away from teaching and learning focus to tracking down students. And for that to negatively impact a school's CCRPI score, graduation rate, all those things are taken into account to grade a school. For that to negatively impact a school when the school has absolutely no control over it is just absolutely ridiculous. It makes no sense, not logical. So that's why we gave an example this time. There's a lot of hoops that obviously you have to jump through to document where a student is enrolled in school if they're not in your school. But and we're not saying we want to dodge the accountability. What we're saying is adjust the calculation rate such that it makes sense of things that you can control in a school versus those that you can't. But last year we didn't get very much traction, if any, to answer your question.
Okay, just to help the chair out here, were we going to go through these one at a time? Or we just want to?
asking. I didn't know if we wanted
All right, what I'd like to do, I want to come, all right, as long as we're on graduation rate, Mr. Sweeney, well, I think Mr. Scamhorn's on a different bullet.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I was going to move it to a different level, so I'll temporarily yield to
Okay, go
Mr.
ahead.
Sweeney.
Why don't you go ahead,
as
Mr. Sweeney, since
weighed
we're
in.
thinking graduation rate at the moment.
Well, I was going to go through the list here. One of the things relative to the graduation rate, how much of that is being driven by any federal regulations? I know there was something to kind of normalize calculation of graduation rates. I don't know if this is this just a state issue, or is this partly a federal issue too?
Yeah, I mean, the federal plays a role in this, and that's to your point, or to your question, Mr. Morgan. There was a little bit of consternation and confusion on, okay, what the feds require versus what the state can take into account. But we believe that this one is one, again, when you're calculating CCRPI and how the schools are graded in Georgia, there's different things that come into play. For example, ESSA, that's the reauthorization of the act from 1965, right? We had No Child Left Behind, and now we've got ESSA. So ESSA, to the Fed's credit, they tried to put as much control back to the state as they could. So when you're looking at what required changes from the federal level impact, they do address graduation rate, but not to the degree that it takes it out of the state's hands. Since we're on that topic, we'll go down the list. So ESSA, the final priority we've got here. What we're asking for in this priority is more flexibility from assessing, and that is state-required assessments. So ESSA provides that flexibility to districts as long as the state adheres to that, and then it's kind of like snowball. You know, it's coming downhill. You know, there are certain options that we're just not able to take advantage of because the state is the gatekeeper and is not going down that path. For example, and I've said this many times, we're not saying we need to stop assessing. You have to assess in order to determine where a child is, where a child is moving, and how much movement is taking place for academic progress. However, an assessment to check a box at the state level does a student absolutely zero good. So if a district, for example, Cobb, we have instituted the RI and MI, where we're assessing literacy and mathematics at grade levels kindergarten through 9th grade to determine on grade level, below, and above grade level. Well, if we're doing that and we're requiring that 3 times a year for every single student, we ought to be able to have that assessment count toward a state assessment instead of having to do a state assessment to check a box. So that's what we're asking for, is that flexibility that has been attempted to be provided to states, i.e. local schools from the federal level, but has since hit a roadblock when it gets to our state. And it's disappointing, it's frustrating, because here you have the feds actually trying to do and have done a great job, have done a good job with the SSA. But, you know, again, you're talking about the Elementary and Secondary Education Act from 1965. Okay, so if they're not changing, then we're certainly moving backwards. Right. So the changes are very encouraging, but it is very frustrating when it gets down to the state level, and then we've hit the roadblock there. That's just disappointing. So that's to speak to that federal kind of level as well. It kind of gets to that point. Sure. ESSA does address graduation rate, but certainly not to the level of our priority.
And the reason I wanted to bring that up, and we've heard the administration talk before, is that, and I believe it's at Osborne High School. So, for example, if you take students at Osborne High School that have remained at Osborne for a 4-year period, the graduation rate is approaching 90%. Is that correct?
It's above 90%.
Yeah. And, you know, maybe, and this is just a thought, you know, for the administration to consider, is, you know, us being kind of the masters of our own destiny with regard to the communication side. There's a way, for example, for us to have, obviously we can report that data. Nothing prohibits us from putting that data out there. And, you know, the thing is you can say, you know, here's the state calculation, but here's what the rate is for students that attend the school and stay here for a 4-year period. I think that demonstrates the fantastic job that the administrators and the teachers within that school are doing to get students across the finish line. I think it is absolutely ludicrous that we have to chase down students that just disappear, you know, and not by their own volition. Their families have said, okay, you know, we're up and out of here, but they leave and there's no trace. And you know, we really, I mean, the taxing time that it takes, you know, just to track those people down administratively, that's debilitating. I mean, that is just not necessary. And I don't know if this is true or not, but, you know, the thing is that I think there's also, it's good for the goose, good for the gander. I think there's different stipulations that the state may even have relative to how our colleges and upper education reports graduation rates. Like, for example, I have not validated this, but, you know, there's certain individuals that'll tell you, as we're going, I have a son that's going to be going to college soon, but some of the people that we're talking will say, you know, well, if you actually said how many students graduate Georgia colleges within a 4-year period, the number is starting, it's low, okay? And yet, I mean, that same standard is not applied across the country. I mean, colleges have different, and they report different graduation rates, and it makes decisions about where families may choose to send their students to college. Well, the same thing can be said for people that are coming here and choosing to go to school. If they see an artificially low graduation rate simply by standards that really penalize you for transiency, it's not necessarily reflective of the great job that the school is doing. And so I think this is a very, very important issue, and certainly welcome this as far as a legislative priority. Thank you.
Thank you, Scott. Okay, Mr. Scamahorn, then Susan, then Mr. Morgan.
Mr. Chair, I think we went around once, and what I'd like to do is, because of the limited time as far as getting it printed, if I may, I'd like to make a formal motion that this be acted upon per the agenda for potential action. So I'd like to make a motion that the board approve this, and then if the motion, and then we could carry on the discussion if you like, if the chair so deems.
No, that sounds good, Mr. Scamahorn. So you've made the motion, and Mr. Sweeney just said he would second. So now we've got the motion, the second, and we'll continue the discussion. So did you have anything else you want to say at this point?
Real quick, I know time is short as far as printing and all, and then this also needs to go out to our adjacent counties too, or should. I won't say needs, but should, so they're informed. So will this gives you plenty of time to get that done? Okay, thank you, Mr. Chair.
All right, Mr. Banks, I'm going to go to Susan and then Mr. Morgan, then I'm going to come back to you, okay?
A legal question, do we need to vote to make this an action item first, and then we can vote on the action item?
No, I think we've got a motion, a second, now we're having some discussion.
But
and then we'll vote.
Can you do that without making it an action item?
It's made an action item. It's listed for potential action.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay, all right, where was I? Okay, Susan.
All right, now we're looking at legislative priorities, but a follow-up on when we were talking about the high transient schools, are we allotting extra staff to deal with the problems that the high transiency schools have? We're not?
No, we don't have room in the budget for allotments to do that, and that's part of this being such a high priority as far as a legislative priority, because people that need to be doing other things are having to try to track down students that have left the school, so that it doesn't hurt their graduation rate and CCRPI at the same time.
That's what I'm saying. It all goes in the schools that are having the highest problems, that have the most difficulty in teaching students, have more staff needed to handle this, and have the highest substitute problems. We're just giving them more problems to deal with, and maybe we need to be making adjustments in some of that in the next year's budget to try to help in these areas where we know they have an undue burden in some way.
We can look at it, but there's no room. The allotments that we have, what are we down to now, Alice?
As you're asking how many allotments I have left?
Yes.
3.5.
So
for the remainder of this year.
Right. So and the reason I bring that up is because at the beginning we have a pool of allotments that we hold back, because when special needs students show up with IEPs that demand a one-on-one para and these kind of things, we have to have those allotments to make sure that we can legally meet the requirements, not just special needs, but when you have undue growth after the start of school in a grade level and those teachers. So the reason I'm so quick to say that we don't have room in the allotment pool for that is because we're down to 3.5 allotments for the rest of this school year, and we're not through December yet. So we can certainly look at how we can address those things during the budget process, but it's.
I was going to say, we're dealing with legislative priorities right now, so
Right.
I'm really out of order in bringing it up. I'll bring it up at another time.
Right.
Okay, thank you.
But you do raise a good point that would be part of the argument supporting this as we talk to the legislature. Okay, now, Mr. Morgan.
Thank you. Back to the graduation rates. Chris, do we have specific anecdotal evidence? Like school A, because of this, schools A had, I think we have some on about foreign governments or whatever the case, 62 kids, this impacted our graduation rate because, and if this was changed, this is what this graduation rate would reflect. Do we have it to that level, or is it as stated, guys, we need to switch this, or do we have actual empirical data from a specific school in terms of how it adversely impacts the district?
So one of the dangers with me is that when something is said, I can tend to remember it if it's a number. So I will say, to me, that's anecdotal, the example I use of Osborne. I'm going to see, because we're talking about this, if we do have the empirical numbers to say emphatically this is why that is. But the graduation rate at Osborne is in the 60s, as Mr. Sweeney alluded to earlier. If you take out the students, or if you just count the students that are at Osborne High School for all 4 years of the high school career, graduation rate for Osborne is in the 90s. So you're talking about a 30-point spread due to transiency and the impact that transiency has on a score. And I also disagree with this as well. When you're using a minimal number of factors to quote-unquote grade a school, if you're not going to take into account some type of equalizing factor to deal with things like transiency, and there's other factors as well to talk about, then you need to adjust the methodology for calculating that graduation rate. You got to do one of the two. To keep it as is and just expect an Osborne High School to, on the surface, according to whatever metric is being promoted today, to look like that for some reason they're not getting it done, that's just wrong. Number one, it's not fair. Number two, you have inappropriately and incorrectly labeled a school to seemingly be unproductive. Because I'm still not going to use the term that they want to try to use for low-performing schools. But, and again, it's incorrect. So when you look at the things going on at Osborne High School, there are great things going on at Osborne High School. When we can show that, okay, the students that are there all 4 years have a graduation rate above 90%, that's awesome. But yet, on whatever scale we're looking at today, that's their graduation rate is in the 60s. So, you extrapolate that example out further. Now, granted, our district graduation rate is an average of all of the high schools, but our district graduation rate is 83. So if you take just the students at Osborne that are there 4 years, they've got a higher graduation rate than the district. How does that make sense? So I think we're trying to, with this legislative priority, get the conversation we're having today to at least be sparked such that, I'm going to back up. I'm glad I caught that before it got too far out. Yeah, no, except I stopped it before it happened, right? So, I'm very passionate about this because, again, you're labeling a school, and if you cannot back up with data to label a school in such a way, then you need to adjust the way that you're creating that label. And I think that's the conversation that needs to be had. We talk about funding and these kind of things, and there's so many politicians that want to say, oh, well, all education wants is more money. Well, this is an example of not. This is not requiring any additional money except for us to keep tracking down these kids to play the numbers game that is constantly created from the state and pushed down to us.
Thank you, Chris. Mr. Banks, you remember what you wanted to say? Huh? I thought you had something. Okay, now let's take a breath. Anybody else got something they want to say? All right. All right. Well, Mr. Sweeney wants to make a comment.
You know, from a procedural standpoint, and I'm actually I'm on the site for the Georgia Department of Education that actually shows the calculations and that kind of stuff. For example, you know, they're taking a look, and there's like a 4-year cohort and there's a 5-year cohort as far as the determination of these graduation rates. And they're taking those students that have actually received a regular diploma within that period of time. But here's just a way that this formula can adversely impact any a school system. And I'm going to use, first of all, an elementary school as an example, just to illustrate a point, not for graduation rate purposes, but Brumby Elementary School, for example, it was my understanding that at one point in time there was approximately 50 different languages that were spoken at that school. 50 different languages, and during the era of No Child Left Behind and you know, other assessments, those students would come to the school, and yet many of them would have taken the class, assessments in English. And some of them have never had any formal education whatsoever. And again, I'm just illustrating a point here. At the high school level, you know, one of the things is it takes into account how many students have transferred into the school. And it also takes into account how many have transferred out. Well, let's say, for example, that all of a sudden a particular area has just a boon of individuals that locate to that area, simply for economic matters more so than anything else. Lots of job creation, lots of people come into the neighborhood or whatever. They may come in, you know, mid-year and that kind of stuff. The denominator for the calculation rises significantly at that point because you just have more students coming in, and it's just formulaic more so than anything else. And it says if you have a high growth area and a lot of people moving into an area, there is a chance that the denominator of the calculation bumps up significantly and adversely impacts that graduation rate. It's truly just formulaic more so than anything else. So this, we have a legislative priority, which is really going to the Cobb delegation. I think, you know, in concert, and to the extent that there's any way that it can be done, is to actually share this information with the Department of Education as well.
Yeah, so I appreciate you saying that. Going back to your question, Mr. Morgan, I just got the information. Osborne tracked down in 1 year 100 students that would have otherwise negatively impacted their graduation rate. That's the good news. The bad news is the total number of students was 300. So they only tracked down a third of the ones that had left. So 200 students counted negatively toward Osborne. So.
Okay. All right. If there's no more discussion, are we ready for the question? All right. And you remember the motion is to accept the superintendent's suggestions for the legislative priorities for 2018. So we have a motion, we have a second. All those in favor, raise your hand. Any opposed? None. It's unanimous. All right. Thank you very much. Now, let's see. So that. Next, we have executive session. If there is a motion to go into executive session for permitted personnel, land, and legal, all three. I'm looking at Mr. Doyle, getting an affirmative nod, right? Okay. Right, okay. So do I have a motion? Mr. Scamahorn? Mr. Scamahorn moves. A second from Mr. Wheeler. Did I hear what? Okay, now, before we vote, I've got to make that inductive leap into how much time it's going to take. So let's round to 10:30, 11:30, because we've got a lot of legal. 12:30. 12:30 sound good? All right. then we will be in executive session. We plan to come back at 12:30. Now, all those in favor,
Why don't you say 12 to 12:30?
12 to 12:30. Okay. All right. All those in favor? Okay, 7-0. All right. So we will be in executive session. Thank you.